development in the countryside policy, which we've kind of touched on a little bit already. And the question set was whether it should be more flexible and less restrictive, whether a lot of these are generated by, rather than by us, is by people's comments, whether the policy overly long and complicated in part duplicates other policies, and whether it would be effective as several shorter targeted development management policies. I don't know whether the council want to make any comment before we start on any of that, or you just want me to go around the table? No.
I think we'll just rely on
what you've seen your MIQs.
Yes, yeah. And obviously respond to others as we go. Yeah.
Okay, excuse me. Does anybody want to make particular comments on this policy outside of what's already been said? Mr. Green.
Well, representing CPR, the countryside charity, just to say that as the countryside charity, we were quite happy with this policy. Didn't find it overly restrictive. Thank you.
That was short and sweet, Mr. Green. Mr. Roberts. I'll point out that the purpose of the hearing is if you've got particular concerns about the policy. So if you're just happy with it, then we'll take that as read. Okay, Mr.
No, I'm not over happy with it. I was wondering if the council could give some sort of clarity as to what they mean by countryside. I'd always taken countryside to be that area of land that exists outside development boundaries. But this is in particular reference to Bridge North and development at Stanmore, where Bridge North has been given a development boundary, and the development boundary in fact includes Tasley New Village, which is fair enough, quite understand that. But then the two allocations that we have problems with are outside the development boundary, and well outside for that matter. And it seems to us that policy SP10 really ought to apply. And so employment development in that location ought to be necessary for the rural area. And I don't think that the council have taken that approach to the development of these two particular sites. And really that's a matter of how you view the countryside and how you view urban areas.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Roberts. I'll ask the council to come back on that point. Presumably these two sites are particular characteristics.
The two sites which Mr. Roberts refers to are proposed releases from the Greenbelt. So they are, I believe that's right, isn't it, Mr. Roberts? Yeah, so yes. I think so. At the moment, they are around Stanmore employment area, the existing Stanmore employment area. The proposal is for those two proposals to extend that employment area. So you'll hear about this probably a little bit more next week on the Matter 6, under exceptional circumstances for Greenbelt. The current employment area does not have a development boundary, and we have not proposed to include one around the two sites we're proposing to remove from the Greenbelt and allocate for additional employment land. I think if there was need for further clarity around that, we would consider a boundary if that would provide more clarity. We feel that because of the nature of the development, it being employment development at that point, we perhaps at the moment our position is it's not necessary because of the types of development which could be allowed in the countryside. But if it would clarify the situation, we could consider that.
So they're being set into the Greenbelt, this site. It will be set as a.
Yes, so the existing business plan the green belt. That these two sites would represent extensions and be removed from the green belt and represent extensions to that site, so they would have the same status. They'd be inset in the green belt. Both development guidelines to inform the development of the site within the plan, which provides sort of certainty about the types of development that's appropriate upon them.
Thank you, that's helpful. And we'll consider next week the things like exceptional circumstances that are required to remove sites from the green belt.
As a general approach, when you're coming to a development management decision on an allocated site that is also outside a development boundary, you would first apply the specific policies of the allocated site. And if there are other general policies that are applied in the countryside which appear to be pulling in different directions, then the usual approach is to give the specific site policies precedence over the more general. But yes, at the moment, as it's currently drafted, those allocated sites are also sites which SP10 would apply to.
Okay, thank you. Is there anybody else wants to comment on policy SP10? Mr. Chong.
We said in our Reg 18 representations that we thought the policy was overly restrictive, so if I can just very briefly set out why we say that. The policy sort of takes an approach that we see in sort of local plans up and down the country, which is to say, well, anything beyond the settlement boundaries countryside, and everything in the countryside is going to be strictly controlled. And in my submission, plans should be reflective of the local circumstances, and should take a more nuanced approach where that's justified. So the difficulty we have with this policy is that it sort of treats all countryside in the same way, regardless of where it's situated. Now we have a plan here which has a settlement hierarchy, and says that its intention is to be urban focused. And as you know, my interest lies in Shrewsbury. Shrewsbury is at the top of the hierarchy, the strategic centre, the most sustainable centre, and yet the countryside around it is being treated in exactly the same way with this policy as the countryside around settlements which are far lower in the hierarchy. And we don't think that's consistent when you look at the plan as a whole. So you'll recall that I mentioned the Northwestern Relief Road around Shrewsbury before, and the opportunities that it gives for development. And there is some recognition of that in the plan already. We see that at page 268, where the plan considers Shrewsbury Place plan area, and it makes clear that the new road will provide an opportunity for development between the settlement boundary and the new road. And it does so with particular reference to, well, only with reference to employment. So the point that we would make is that the policy should be modified in the case of Shrewsbury, so that it is much more flexible in terms of allowing housing to come forward, provided it does so as part of a whole estate plan. Which, as you know, is our interest. So there's a real opportunity here to take the benefit of the whole estate plan policy in the plan and respond to local circumstances and the opportunities provided by new transport infrastructure, and use both of those to further the overarching objective of the plan of having an urban focus. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chung. Mr. Cardinal, you want to come back?
I think we very much consider that SP10 is consistent with the wide spatial strategy within the local plan. It very much reflects the urban focus and also the role of community hubs and community clusters within the rural areas that sort of focus for rural development. It specifically affordable exception sites across subsidy development in a residential context, and also various forms of economic development that are appropriate in a rural context. we feel that balance is very much consistent with the wider strategy, and as such we consider that it's an appropriate policy.
So presumably other sites in the countryside, you would expect them to come forward through the development plan processes eventually to become the allocation, so put forward through the search for call for sites process, etc., be done in that way.
That's exactly the case, yes. That's the starting position from the plan, in terms of a plan-led approach. Obviously we do recognise, and we are alive to the potential that obviously planning applications can happen outside that with material considerations, but that's obviously the starting position from the plan. There was one point I was going to make, and it's late in the day and my memory is failing me, so if I remember so yeah, I'll come back to that for
Okay. Are there any other points on policy SP10 before we move on to SP12? We obviously, Mr. Maxwell, we're skipping 11 because that's a green belt policy that we come back to next week. SP10, Mr. Maxfield.
Yeah, it's just to echo what Mr. Chung has said, essentially to respond to the council's point. It is a plan-led system. A plan and the process of endorsement would be part of that plan-making process, and so therefore would go through the appropriate tests and consultation, not as a development plan, but as similar to other community-led plans, etc. So therefore, evidence provided within a whole state plan at a more granular scale would provide the objectively assessed need for small-scale housing development in certain circumstances, and it needs some adjustment of the policy to take account of whole state plans. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to come back on that, Mr. West?
yeah, I recall what I was meant to say before, and then I'll come back on that point. It was just in response to Mr. Chung's points about the urban growth agenda, and therefore, if I'm correct in what he was saying, in that there should be a greater degree of leeway around potential for residential development in those urban areas because of the agenda. I would push back on that a little bit and say, well, that the guidelines in those settlements and the opportunities we've allocated already cater for that urban growth. Whether it's a town like Shrewsbury or a village like Longdon, there needs to be some certainty for the decision maker and for the community around what the countryside is on that point. So I don't necessarily accept that point.
Yeah, just picking up on the points regarding whole state plans, I think obviously we get to but I think it's important to recognise what we consider the role of whole state plans to be. The intention would be that they would be to supplement the existing plan, and I think that's very much I'm sure this is something we'll discuss on that. And I think SP10 provides certainty about what the role of development in the countryside is, but in the context of the whole state plan overall. I think that's important, and we consider that it's appropriate having regard to the strategy. And again, without preempting discussions on SP15, we consider that the approach that we are taking to whole estate plans is positive, but equally recognise the fact that they are part of the development plan, and being in accordance with the development plan. So they supplement it.
Thank you, Mr. Corden. Anybody else want to make any comments? No. Okay, so that's policy SP10. So if we move on to SP12, which is economic growth strategy, and that was the one that there was some comments on from people that have now left. So if we incorporate those when the council are responding to those. I haven't got any questions on SP12. Do the council particularly want to say anything? Yeah, it's all right.
Have a quick shift around. I think we just want to just say a few words. I'll just wait for my colleague Mr. Cowan to set up.
Yes, ma'am, I just wanted to recap on this morning. We talked about the relationship between the Planning Policy Service and the Economic Growth Service in the delivery of the Economic Growth Strategy and the role that the local plan will play in that. In response to the point about the relationship to housing and employment, in order to deliver the economic growth strategy, there will be a need for additional land in order to meet demand that is coming, and that will meet the needs of the existing residents of significant settlements, as well as the new residents looking for employment in the county.
Thank you. Mr. Munro, is it? I can't quite see your name. Yes.
Thank you, Mrs. Crosby. Obviously, first time spoken today. I'm Alex Munro, representing Manor Oak Homes. Despite the name of my client, they're a promoter of all types of development land. In this instance, their interest is about approximately 30 hectares of land adjacent to Battlefield round about Shrewsbury. That's the background. Obviously, we have comments on policy SP12, SP13, SP14. I mean, they are all sort of generally interlinked and read as a bit of a suite which guides economic development in Shropshire. I can pretty much isolate out the comments for SP12. I think
would it be helpful to take 12, 13 and 14 together? I'm happy for you to do that.
Yeah, I think I can probably deal with 12 separately. I think 13 and 14 are far more interlinked. So come that question, I might speak about them combined. I think on SP12, I think the main comment is I'm not entirely sure what the purpose is. I mean, I think it's a policy which could exist inside or outside of a policy box. It could serve as a very useful policy, but at the moment it reads far more as a sort of an overarching vision rather than a strategy. It's got sort of similar characteristics to policy SP1. And it's not necessarily a policy which either sort of enables or restricts or necessarily governs the delivery of development. Obviously within the plan, in terms of economic development land, there are targets, 300 hectares across the whole plan area, 100 hectares at Shrewsbury with a residual requirement of about 50, and then 30 hectares for the Black Country's residual need. I think obviously we know the targets for the local plan. I think one of the questions is what happens if the sort of supply at the council's preferred locations stall in terms of allocations, existing commitments. How will this shortfall be met? I mean, policy SP2 states that the local plan seeks to ensure that sufficient land in the right locations is available to achieve these employment growth aspirations. However, the availability of land will be kept under review to ensure a continuous supply of suitable sites is available. I mean, my view is that the policy SP12 is the ideal place to build in some sort of monitoring mechanisms, something which obviously are measurable, which would allow contingencies, obviously if supply slips, if the sites set out in the delivery trajectory in the annexes of the plan, if they don't deliver on time, and it could effectively present a number of triggers which say, okay, we're not meeting our supply, we're not matching the pace of housing delivery, which is one of the key aspirations of the plan, in which case there's a greater weight given to bringing suitable windfall sites forward at suitable locations, be it strategic corridors and around Shrewsbury, at some of the larger settlements. I mean, I think on this basis, I mean, as it stands, I mean, obviously the question is it justified, effective, or consistent with national policy? Now, currently, we don't feel it's effective, nor do we feel it's consistent with national policy. That's on the basis of criteria A and criteria D of paragraph 82 of the MPPF. I think what we have done in our statement, and obviously I don't need to read these recommendations out, but that paragraph 2.6 of our submission on this matter, we have set out 3 potential amendments to the policy that would actually allow it to be presented as something which generally helps deliver a strategy rather than describe kind of broadly what the council are seeking to achieve. And I think it could build in triggers which actually allows, I mean, obviously our client's land sits outside the plan framework at the moment, but we have been marketing consistently. We know it's good to go. We know it's a deliverable development site. It is something that could come forward more readily if we understand that there is a trigger which would allow us to press the button on a planning application. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Monroe. Do the council want to respond on that?
Well, the purpose of SP12 is to bring into the plan the aims and objectives of the Shropshire Economic Growth Strategy, and in that way we will achieve the objective of MPPF para 82A to have a clear strategy. And in doing that, we would draw down the weight provided by paragraph 81 that significant weight should be afforded to economic growth objectives. The delivery of that is intended to come through policy SP13 and SP14, and that's where the monitoring will be directed in order to check delivery against those objectives, and that's where economic growth would receive notification where we were falling behind on the expected delivery. Policy SP13 would allow, where the market saw the opportunity, would allow for the windfall opportunities in the SP13 policy to be tested against demand in the market. That would, of course, direct attention to the availability and the delivery of allocations within the settlement affected, which is an appropriate objectives for the local plan.
Thank you. I think one of the points was made, and I think you've maybe sort of covered that, was that it's really about aims and objectives. If this SP12 rather than a policy as such, I think that was a point that was made. It's not a policy. It's a list of aims and objectives.
Well, it does introduce the urban focus and the hierarchy of settlements. It does provide an explanation of expectations from economic development proposals in section 4. And in section 5, it provides the decision maker with important signposting around the rest of the plan framework in order to ensure that appropriate consideration is made of the need for and the supporting development for the delivery of economic development. So we feel it is an appropriate policy, and it provides the decision maker with an important strategic overview on economic development proposals.
Thank you. Mr. Green, did you want to comment on this policy?
Yes, thank you. Well, it's been identified that it's more of a vision than a policy. I think the term is set by the opening statement, isn't it? Shropshire will be the best place to do business and invest. Surely planning policy is not a matter of competition. That rather hubristic aim seems a bit like the claim that might have made that he will be the best prime minister. It might be well. It's unevidenced, therefore unjustified, therefore unsound in that context. And just a couple of comments on growth generally and climate change. Reminded of what Greta Thunberg's message to world leaders in 2019 was, we are in the beginning of a mass extinction and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? And about the long-term consequences of persistent growth is actually illustrated by this room. Sorry, Mrs. Crosby, it won't take long. Evolution is fixed. So for true sustainability, at some point, there has to be no steady state. The climate emergency and biodiversity emergency tells that that point is probably now. And just a question for the Council. They've just launched a consultation into a new draft of the economic growth strategy, which closes in something like 6 weeks' time. That's an update for 2022 to 27. Is it intended that SP12 will be updated to reflect that? Because at the moment it's referring to the existing economic growth strategy for the 5-year period before that.
Presumably that would be done through a main modification. Often those sorts of things happen towards the end of the process as a sort of tidying up exercise. Is that's...
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Mr. Green is correct. The update to the economic growth strategy is it's a time issue thing really, because it was launched yesterday. In fact, the consultation. Yes, I think it's not intended to be a huge alteration approach. It was more to do with the change in the time frame of the original economic growth strategy and in needing an update on that one. So that's where that lay really. But yes, we can deal with that through a main modification. If I may just come back to a point which Mr. Monroe made, if I may, it was a point which he's made in his matters statement, referring to the site SHR 166 being undeliverable, demonstrably undeliverable employment allocation on SHR 166, which is our proposed employment allocation, by virtue of the critical concerns of Historic England. I will say those have not been resolved yet. We obviously are aware that Historic England have an objection in, and their scheduling department are considering the scheduling of that site at the moment, but we have not got a conclusion on that. So I just want to make that point about that. Okay.
Yeah, and we'll come to that in stage 2 as well, again, in terms of the details of that site.
Just 2 more points. SP12 start with a high-level aspiration, but that is the economic growth strategy, and that's where we begin. As you move through the policy, it moves from the general to the specific, and therefore gets to the point as you move through criteria 2, 3, 4 and 5. It is true that we are affected by climate change, but the response to that is not to stop, but is to do things differently and to do things better. And that's recognised within the economic policies and throughout the plan.
Thank you, Mr. Cowden. Anybody else want to say anything on SP12?
I see that policy SP12 and policy SP13 have both got a one-line reference to the green belt, I've assumed that the green belt will be discussed in more detail next week.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
we leave comments on that until next week. Is that all right?
Yeah, we'll deal with the green belt next Wednesday from memory.
Yeah, but it'll require a reference back probably to policies 12 and 13.
Yeah, so it's policy SP11, isn't it? And there is reference in there to other policies. So I'm happy for you to leave that till then, that's fine.
Mrs. Crosby, I think I'm over here.
I wonder where the voice was coming from.
No. I think I have some comments to make on SP12 if I can, please. I do so also alongside SP13 and 14 because they are interrelated. I'll deal with some other more specific matters relating to SP13 and 14 when we turn to them, but for the purposes of dealing with them as a suite, I indicated this morning that the position of the Council, as supported by various policy documents, including, of course, the growth strategy itself, is to establish a step change within the east of Shropshire in the M54 strategic corridor, and that step change, of course, is in respect of economic growth. And if one wants to see that identified specifically in the context of SP12, one can do so at paragraph 3.118 of the written statement. Now that step change, which is identified within SP12, is, as I said earlier on, enhanced by the fact that it's acknowledged that there's an outstanding black country need as well, amounting to some 210 hectares in employment land. Of course, we know that that figure has been dealt with further by the Black Country authorities, and we'll deal with that on Tuesday. But that's the sort of headline that one needs to take away when one's looking at the ability of this policy to achieve what it says it achieves. Now, the policy should, alongside SP13 and 14, of course, make proper provision to enable that step change to be achieved within the relevant strategic corridor, and to do so now if that need exists, because that's what policy tells you to do, government policy that is, and not to delay it and not to leave it to windfalls. In short, the point needs to be grappled with if there's a need. We'll of course again deal with the extent of that need, as I say, on Tuesday. The question is whether or not the plan actually does anything to achieve that particular aim in the context of the M54 strategic corridor. And we say in simple terms that it doesn't, and I'll just very briefly say why. There are three, unless this is on an optimistic basis, three potential locations where employment provision is made within the strategic corridor that could be regarded as strategic. And in truth, none of them can. Shifnal, firstly, has a net provision of 15 hectares, and it doesn't even meet the strategic site definition within the sustainability appraisal, see Appendix T for your reference. And it's constrained, as you've already heard, in highway terms, accessibility and flooding terms, and I'll give two references. The neighbourhood plan at 2.9 through to 2.20, and the local plan at 5.207. I would, and that's being optimistic and generous, if it's said to be within the M54 corridor in the east of the region, provide something like 5 hectares of employment land, and Cosford is simply dealing with particular forms of development, including the intensification of the RAF Museum and the air ambulance. Now, the written statement to the plan, I've already referred to it, but again, 3.118, doesn't recognise the potential for larger windfall developments to provide for the economic aims within the strategic corridor. But it does, as I said, simply by reference to windfall. And so if the need exists, which we say it does, it is recognised in the plan that should be located in the sort of area that I've identified. And I say that, as no doubt will be clear, the plan as yet is ineffective to achieve its aims or objectives. And we're supported by the approach that we have already set out, insofar as Walsall and Dudley, two councils who feel keenly the degree of need in employment terms, say that there should be proper provision made within the Shropshire area. So for those reasons, SP12 is not effective to achieve its aims when read alongside SP13 and 14.
Yeah, we consider the policy to be effective. To the list of sites that Mr. Reid has identified, we would also add the employment allocations at Bridgnorth. The purpose is not to invite larger infill development on the basis that we've made inadequate provision, because we don't believe that's true. We believe we have made more than adequate provision in order to deliver the objectives of policy SP12 and SP13. What the policy suite of policies does is attempts to put in place a proper framework to deal with demand that Shropshire is likely to experience from the effect of the economic growth strategy and the efforts of the economic growth service and the framework that lies behind that.
Thank you, Mr. Cowden. Anybody else want to comment on that? Ms. Ellis?
Thank you very much. We've actually got the two tabs. Mr. Burns, we're going to do a double point, but I'll deal with words and he'll deal with numbers. Briefly, if we may. To the point which Mr. Young made before he departed, which was really a hangover from this morning's point about whether or not employment and housing provision are sufficiently in step. And Mrs. Crosby, our suspicion is that the plan is internally consistent in this regard, and that Mr. Young's point with respect, his averaged approach, a strictly averaged mathematical approach, ignores the strategic shift of the plan. And when you come back to reconsider this point, we'd invite you to look at paragraph 2.19 of the justification, which reminds us about the shape of the plan, the strategy of the plan, being to seek to provide a sustainable pattern of growth, responding to the various needs and functions of the county's hierarchy of settlements. And Bridgnorth is one of a number of settlements which is second tier in the hierarchy, beneath Shrewsbury, which is first in the hierarchy. And then down in the supporting text at 221, it uses the phrase, the plan provides a broad basis for dealing with a number of challenges in a balanced and positive manner, and it lists housing needs and economic growth needs amongst those. So the text there is recognising that distribution of growth is not an exact mathematical science. There's a great deal of planning judgment involved in it, and the balancing of objectives or desiderata. And to take Mr. Young's suggested very strictly mathematical approach, x plus 1 equals z, is not in line with the strategic approach of the plan. And so the charge of inconsistency is not made out. Mr. Burns is now going to make good this point with some quick numbers for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Obviously, you were presented with a figure of 37 dwellings per hectare per 1 hectare of employment land. If you go through the plan policies S1 to S18 and look at the development guidelines for each settlement area, and focus on the urban areas are, i.e. the key centres, principal centres, and the strategic centre of Shrewsbury, the urban is actually 60 hectares, so 60 dwellings per 1 hectare of employment land across the urban area. So that hopefully puts in mind the appropriateness of the figure that's been presented to you earlier. Looking specifically at the principal centres, which obviously Bridge North is one, the average is actually exactly the same across the 5 principal centres, and that's 46 hectares per 1 hectare of employment land being delivered, which is the figure that I also presented for Bridge North earlier today. Obviously, you can go through the process yourself, but it just puts, hopefully that puts into mind that 103 hectare figure isn't really representative of the strategic approach of the plan.
Thank you, Mr. Burns. Does the council want to come back on that at all?
Thank you, it's just doing the work.
I didn't necessarily want to come back on that point, but I think I just wanted to come back on a point which Mr. Reid made about the nature of our strategic sites and what has been essayed or otherwise. I think you mentioned the Shift Knoll employment site having not been essayed in the context of the strategic sites. If I might be misrepresenting what you said there, but
no, that's not right.
So if you could, sorry.
So it didn't fit in the definition of strategic site for the purposes of Appendix T. That's all.
Well, we don't agree with that. We do feel it is a strategic site in the context, and which is why it was essayed within the context of our strategic sites when we consulted on that at that part of the process. So we do consider that to be a strategic site.
All right, thank you, Mr. West. I thought my computer had died then. Let's have a look. So I think that concludes SP12, doesn't it? So we've got quite a little bit still to get through. I'm conscious it's 20 to 6. We've got SP13 and 14. I think it seems as though there's people want to speak on those matters, and the whole estate plans. I get the sense that there's some debate to be had on that. And then we've got things like windfall, 10%. There's quite a bit still to get through. I can't see how we'll get through it in the next 20 minutes. It's very unrealistic. So it's one of the things we just quit and accept that we're going to have to come back at some point. Mr. Durbin, did you want to say something?
I've just, Much Wenlock has simply one point to make on policy SP14, and I feel it's quite important that we should be allowed to make it.
I'm not saying you can't make it. What I'm saying is we would reconvene at a different time and day, because there's clearly lots of points still need to be made, so we need to sort of consider how that's done. There was
Our point is very short, and
but lots of people could say the same. So, we had a discussion with the programme officer when we was pulling together this agenda that we thought it was probably quite optimistic, today's timetable, and I think it was agreed with the council that we could continue it as a virtual session if necessary. I'm conscious that we don't want to have to come back here at a date that's probably much further in the distance than. Do you have a view on that?
We would support an interactive session as a mop-up session. I think that's a very practical solution. I think obviously the issue is finding a date. I'm just conscious of after next week we are into holiday season a little bit then, which may or may not affect a lot of people in this room. But I think that in principle, an interactive session as a mop-up is very much supported by the council.
Yes, there's a number of policies to get through. There's a huge amount of people involved in those, so it does kind of lend itself to a virtual event. I'm conscious of the cost of hiring these things, the time involved in organising it all and things. We've got technology available to us all now, so.
Yeah, we do have the technology available. We've utilised that through Teams Live, I think it's called, which is what we use in COVID times for committee days. So most authorities did. So we do have the ability to do that and to share links as appropriate. So it can be done. I think the issue is just a date really on this one.
Something for you to think about overnight, and I'm not making any submissions one way or the other. You could look at the programme for the rest of these 2 weeks and ask yourselves whether there is any matter that you felt could be effectively dealt with as a whole in an interactive forum, and then use any time freed up that way next week to finish off this if you thought this was better done in the room. But I don't invite you to think on your feet, but it just occurred to me that might be something to think about.
I did think Wednesday when we're dealing with the green belt might not take all day, but then I was conscious if we tell everybody to come at a certain time and green belt's still going on, then we've got the other is Friday morning when we've got the Gypsy and Traveller session, which we don't anticipate that's going to take very long. There's no speakers on it. I'm not sure. Mr. Dillon's leading on that. I don't think you've got a huge amount of questions for the council. I think probably a lot of it's based on what's been submitted. So that's the other option. Is we've got potentially Friday morning. I think we've got a bit of an overspill potentially Friday morning for the matter 8. I think, haven't we?
I mean, even if you wanted to start with overspill, and then if we ran out of time on Friday, you could bump the Gypsy and Traveller questions off to a virtual session just between you and the council at a later date.
Yeah. It's whether matter 8 overruns into Friday, but
we do have this room booked for Friday. Now, I'm pretty sure we booked it all day, so and not just the morning. So it does free up a bit of space there, unless obviously people have other commitments on Friday.
That's what you see everybody frantically running around in the background wondering about availability and things.
I don't know whether I'm sorry to pipe up simply because I've been piping up quite a lot over the last few days, but I was just wondering whether if there is some idea about Friday, whether that could be thought about being virtual as well, or instead rather than being an in-person attendance.
We could, because we'll be here anyway, we could sit in our retiring room and work virtually, but I'm sure that could be done, which would allow some more flexibility further, wouldn't it? I don't know whether the council... I
just thought I'd float it. You've got an opportunity to think about it, and then to issue a missive or tell us on Tuesday.
I don't think these matters are going to take a huge amount of time, but it's time. But I think everybody's getting tired, including us, and it's not a good way to deal with things really in a rushed fashion. So I think Friday with people, the problem is we can't do a mix of virtual and real life. The technology, part of my role in COVID, as well as being an inspector, was trying to work out how we resolve the immediate issue of keeping things on track, and we went through this whole process of how we did things, and we found that what we called blended events at the time were hugely difficult and expensive to set up. There's no way we can do that next Friday. So I think it'd have to be on one or all the others, so it'd have to be all virtual or all in the room. And we'll have a think about it overnight, but I don't have a problem with it being all virtual next Friday, I don't think. And that would allow people to work would give more flexibility in terms of travel, wouldn't it?
It would also save me a little bit of money as well. But not
in person.
Yes, absolutely. So it might be Mr. Dillon and I retired in the room just to work from the hotel room.
And our council will have all this room because it's booked anyway. In seriousness, we are very flexible on this one, but obviously we are alive to the needs of others who obviously may not be available, and conscious fact it is Friday.
We have Friday on the timetable anyway, don't we? So that's probably easier than trying to... And the students going on holiday at the end of the following week, so it all starts to become a bit...
Okay.
Does anybody else have any thoughts?
If I must just say, is it possible, because bearing in mind that those people who are left here this evening will probably be here on Tuesday morning, would it be possible to run this over and start again on Tuesday morning just to get through these?
Yeah, the difficulty is we've got people coming for a completely different session on Tuesday, which is time to... So once you start doing that, it has a knock-on effect, and before you know it, you end up with multiple changes rather than...
You haven't got so much to cover on Tuesday that you've got...
No, my concern is that not so many different things, it's trying to contain it so it has a limited impact on the rest of the programme, which is the difficulty. Did you want to say to me, Mr. Barnes? No, wanted to speak. Does anybody else have any comments on that, or whether you've got availability? Presumably, if people have difficulty with access to technology, the council could help with that.
So
issues that came up was sort of in COVID. Some people had difficulty accessing a laptop or whatever that had Wi-Fi so that they could dial into things. Would the council be able to help with that if somebody had a particular issue and they could maybe come here and have a laptop with Wi-Fi or something so that...
I'm going to say yes, but I will need to check. Yeah, obviously, people who we have strict regulations about our own IT, so it might need to be they might need to be sat by an IT person at that point. I'm going to say yes. I'm going to say yes.
I mean, I think it doesn't seem that anybody's got a particular issue with that. Most people, I think, now are connected, aren't they? But yeah. Would that be a problem, Mr. Roberts? No. Okay, so it seems as though that's not an issue we need to contend with, but we'll think about it overnight. It's 10 to 6 now, so we'll address it first thing in the morning. And what we'll do, we'll get Kerry and Ian to put something on the website so that everybody's aware. So if people are not here tomorrow, we'll get an update, put as a news update, and we'll get Kerry to notify everybody from the programme this afternoon via an email or whatever what the situation is. Is that okay with everybody? Okay, thank you, and thanks for your perseverance today. Thank you.